back to Do You Know What You Know? I'm Delnaz.
I'm Lauren, and this week we had on Andrea Dolph. She talked about productive disagreement. Delmas, what was your favorite part of the episode?
My favorite part of the episode was how throughout the entire episode she described how, learning these skills to disagree productively is a continuous process and it doesn't happen overnight or just by, reading an article on it. It really is, you grow and learn throughout your entire life, throughout your career and your personal life, how to get better at this skill. What was your favorite part?
My favorite part was probably when she talked about how productive disagreement is something that is uncomfortable and can feel isolating at times. And I think that's really important for people to remember that it's not something that you're automatically good at. And I think that's really something that I took away from the conversation, glad that we talked about and glad that she brought up. And I think that was really awesome that we were able to discuss this.
Yes, I agree. Thank you all for tuning in and enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Do You Know What You Know? Today we are joined with a very special guest. So I'm going to let you give a brief introduction and also expand on your educational and career background.
Okay, good morning, and thank you for inviting me to do this. I'm really excited about talking about this topic that is very important to me. Um, my background is a little bit unusual, I guess. That's what people tell me. I have an undergraduate degree in Russian from the University of Virginia. And when I got that degree, it was during the Cold War. Yeah, I'm that old. And the Soviet Union still existed, and there really wasn't that much to do with a Russian degree, except what I ended up doing, which was work for the CIA for 3 years. And that was a really interesting experience, and actually, in some regards, contributed to some of my attitudes toward productive disagreement, but we'll get to that a little bit later. When I went to the CIA, they said they test you every way you can imagine, and they told me I would leave after 3 years because the bureaucracy would drive me crazy, and I left 3 years to the week. And went to work for GE. At the same time, I was starting in a master's degree in computer science. And that really launched an interesting and incredibly growth-oriented career for approximately the next 20 years, working in the classified satellite business and then moving ultimately into information technology and supporting the business more from a application of technology to business problems. My kids were growing up. It was hard to maintain a career like that at that time, to be honest. So I did some consulting for a couple of years. And then I reconnected with one of my old colleagues from GE, and we started a company called Pragmaticus Inc. And that company was based on something that happened to me when I was at GE. We were in a layoff situation. And I noticed that the people that were on the top of the list to get laid off were all the recent hires. And fortunately for them, GE had a policy that said you couldn't be laid off if you were within 3 years of having graduated from college. So they were protected, but it still was a fascinating experience. And a different colleague of mine, Linda Clemens, and I started taking notes on what were people doing that were getting them let go or not doing so well in their career. And we ultimately wrote a book called Hit the Ground Running, or Hit the Job Running, sorry, Hit the Job Running. And it was just workplace skills that you're not really ever taught in school, but you really need them to be successful, more so probably than specific knowledge sometimes. So Ray and I ended up doing a consulting business in that where we trained entry-level people at corporations. We did a lot of speaking engagements and decided we wanted to enrich our experience. And both of us ended up teaching at Wharton, teaching business communication at Wharton. At the time, they only had an MBA level program, and we were both part-time lecturers. And then I got hired on full-time teaching at the MBA level. And then I don't know, 10 years ago or so, the dean, undergrad dean, was updating the curriculum and said, I want an undergraduate business communication program. So I was tapped to create that. And it was based on the MBA program, but with some major modifications, and was responsible for everything, the curriculum, hiring people, all of the policies. Um, it's really pretty exciting, actually. But communication was not something that I was actually formally trained in, but had absolutely leveraged it throughout my career. And that, after getting that in place, and we're talking 80 sections every single year, I have had 35 part-time lecturers, 2 full-time people, about 60 TAs supporting this program. We grew it to include an entrepreneurial course. We just launched right before, or right as I was retiring, an international version of the class. And we also got a $2 million grant from a donor to work on productive disagreement, which is just really an extension of communication. So that's kind of a windy road. I tried to be concise describing it, but a variety of experiences through my life that have led me to this point. Yeah.
Such a fascinating background, and I highly recommend the book, Hit the Job Running. It's a great introduction. It's a great just basis for like what you need to know on the job, like you said.
It's
So in part,
dated. I will say that it's dated, but it's kind of
no,
universal information.
yes, but so much of what's in the book still applies today. So, in part one of this episode, we talked about tactics. Delnaz and I talked about tactics that we use when navigating political discussions with family and friends. And today we want to talk about something that largely relates to that, called productive disagreement, like you mentioned. Before we get super into it, can you give like a brief description of what productive disagreement is and what it means?
Absolutely. Very simply, if you just look at those 2 words, productive disagreement, what it is leveraging different viewpoints to achieve a positive outcome. Very simple. And my favorite illustration of that takes us back to 1727 with Benjamin Franklin. He created something called the junto, which is based on a Spanish word for assembly or togetherness, I think. I don't know, I'm not a Spanish speaker. And what this was it was a group of 12 people that met every single Friday for several years with their ale. I mean, can't you imagine them in Philadelphia? But the purpose was to get together and disagree. And they would pick a topic each week and they would come prepared to disagree about it with 2 intentions. One was to try to come up with better alternatives or outcomes for the community, but also for self-growth, to learn different perspectives, to learn from each other. And they were adamant that this was not about winning, about debating and being like fighting kind of, but debating for growth. And they even went so far too as to say that if they were too kind or agreeable, they would fine each other. So if you got to be too like, oh, I agree, yeah, you're so right. Nope, you got fined for that kind of behavior. So they came together and disagreed every single week. And some of the outcomes from this several year experience were the first lending library, a volunteer militia, and University of Pennsylvania was created from these. So I just love that story because it illustrates so well people coming together to disagree, but really producing some incredible outcomes.
Thank you for that description. I certainly learned from that. And now, following Lauren's question, many people say that productive disagreement has become more difficult in recent years for a variety of reasons I can imagine. Why would you think that is, if you believe that?
I do think that's true. I absolutely think that's true. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. Um, First is it's just really hard to get unbiased information and you all know from what you do, um, it's just really hard. So to really have a productive disagreement takes a lot of work to gather that kind of information.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting to think about how environment and how like technology plays into the usefulness of productive disagreement and the difficulty of engaging in it.
Because
Um,
I would also add that, you know, especially when you're talking about social media, you can be a bit anonymous, or you can say things that are cruel or have negative impact, and you don't feel that interaction. So it's easier to be negative than if you were
yeah,
just sitting face to face.
absolutely. Um, in your experience, both in like being in the business world, working in the business world, and then also teaching at Wharton, how do you see the ability to engage in productive disagreement as a critical skill for future business leaders and current business leaders?
Well, when I was still, before I retired, we actually were out talking to businesses about the role of productive disagreement in their businesses. And every executive we talked to said it was an absolute imperative skill. And they were frustrated by especially younger people that were more impacted by social media and their fear of speaking up. So some of the areas where it's an important skill in business is in decision making. I mean, just think of the breadth of experience that, or breadth of control, I'll say, that an executive has when making a decision. And you think, you know, you can't be an expert in all of those areas, and you might get impressions of something that's correct or how things should work, but the people on the ground closest to some of these issues are the ones that really would know better. So you have to be willing to be open to hearing different opinions based on different people's experiences. And that it's not just people on the ground, it's even your whole team comes together with different knowledge and experiences. Innovation. Innovation, there was an organization once devoted to creativity. And they said there's no such thing as a new idea. It's putting together two things that have never been put together before to produce something useful, interesting, or beautiful. Well, if you don't have productive disagreement and people sharing these kind of off the wall ideas at times, then you're going to stifle some of your innovation. Teamwork. How can teams work well together if people feel stifled, if they feel like they can't be heard for having a different opinion? And then related to that, employee satisfaction. You want to feel like you're contributing to the outcome of your organization. And if you can't express your opinions, which may differ, then you're not going to feel heard or satisfied. So I think in a business world, I mean, that's never going to go away, in my opinion, all of those skills and the need for productive disagreement. From a personal standpoint, I also just think that it's critical for personal growth. You know, if you're just sitting in your own bubble all day long, what are you going to learn or grow from if you can't hear some new ideas, have your opinions challenged? It just helps you to become a better thinker, a broader thinker, um, yeah, just more effective overall.
Thank you for that. And just to expand on the personal side of it, what are some tips you would give to someone going back to the part one of the episode we filmed, Lauren and I, is I think we're going to title it Dinner Table Politics. What are some tactics you would give to people who maybe want to de-escalate, not, without just saying shutting it down completely, but de-escalating it, making sure it's productive rather than too heated? What would you say to somebody who's trying to learn this skill?
I think that there's two pieces to being able to engage in, or two phases, I'll say, to being able to engage in productive disagreement. One is you have to be mentally ready to engage in it. And some of the dimensions of being mentally ready are one, truly that commitment to having a positive outcome and not coming into the conversation thinking, I have to be right. I have to convince everybody that my opinion is the right opinion, but just have a conversation for growth and a positive outcome. One of my favorite dimensions of productive disagreement, which is related to this, is being a curious person and really wanting to know, well, why do you think that? There was an office manager back when I was at Wharton who he started before COVID. The two of us couldn't have been more different. He, male, female, he's 30, more than 30 years younger than me, different political views, different ethnicity, different, I mean, you name it. We're about as different as we could be. And the first day we met, we despised each other because we got into an argument about who the greatest musician of all time was. What a silly topic to start, to dislike each other about, but we just had this instant dislike. And I wish I could tell you like this magic moment where suddenly we turned around and changed our opinion, but it did happen. And somehow we got into this mode of being curious about each other's opinions and asking questions and suggesting books to read and different, just exploring together. And it became such a fun thing for us to do. We never changed our political alliance, but I think the two of us both came more to the center of what we believed in. And we just, the office benefited because it was a much more peaceful relationship, but we just personally benefited. And I would say, looking back, because he's moved on and I have too, that relationship is one of my most cherished business relationships, friendships that I ever had in my whole career. We still stay in touch. So, but the role of curiosity, getting back to my point, the role of curiosity was so critical for us to be able to move forward. And then I guess the final thing I would say, as far as this readiness piece, is just a willingness to feel uncomfortable, a willingness to be the only one in the room that feels a certain way. That takes time. I think it takes a certain level of maturity, but that's just the preparation piece. You said specifically techniques. Well, then once you're ready to engage, then the actual engagement requires a certain ability or skill. And some things that I would suggest there is, again, ability to listen. So just close your mouth and just listen to what the other person has to say and try to do so without judgment, without bias, but to really hear what's being said. A second technique, learn how to ask questions in an unoffensive way. So if you're trying to probe, one of the first classes I took at GE as a manager was a communication class. They really believed in communication. And they said, if you ask a question that you could append "you dummy" to the end of, you've asked the question poorly. So, right, so think about that. Lauren, why in the world would you ever have that opinion, you dummy? So you think about, how do you phrase the question so it's not offensive? Another dimension of asking a question is, what's your tone when you're asking it, or what's your body language? Are you sitting, looking, arms crossed and looking kind of angry? Are you leaning in and like, tell me more. I'm interested in hearing. You want to make sure you're not attacking people. You're attacking ideas if you're going to go into a debate. And then the final thing would just be a willingness, again, to look for another option. You think A, I think B, let's see if we can get to C.
Thank you for that. So the story with the office manager is really interesting. So thank you so much for sharing that. What are some other productive disagreement skills that that you have built over your career that have helped you facilitate more effective communication, maybe disagreements? Any other examples that you would like to share?
Well, I'll elaborate on the not attacking the person, but attacking the idea. I was having lunch. Well, I worked for GE for many, many years, and they really had a culture of productive disagreement. In fact, when we merged with Martin Marietta later, it was disturbing to Martin Marietta for a while because we were so into this culture. You were expected as a manager to hear differing opinions from your employees. And that just was the expectation, and we were all very comfortable with that. And it was to the point that GE had a training facility up in New York, and every Friday, either Jack Welch, who is the CEO, or somebody in his inner circle would helicopter over to this training facility and go to this room called the Pit. And that was the nickname. And whatever the issue was of what was the company was grappling with, then various people who were in the training classes could be invited to go and argue with Jack Welch or somebody from the inner circle with no negative repercussions whatsoever. Again, it was because that executive team understood the value of learning from other viewpoints. And the culture, I was having lunch with a friend of mine who was one of the first female executives at GE, and she was talking the other day about, yeah, remember we could be fighting viciously over how to structure code or something, software. And then we'd say, oh, time for lunch. Where do you want to go to lunch? So all of a sudden, bam, that disagreement was just totally put aside, and people would go have lunch together, probably come back and keep arguing afterwards.
Do you have any advice on how we can still remain in a productive disagreement atmosphere without accepting or promoting false notions and promoting misinformation?
Yeah, you have to pay attention to your sources, make sure they're credible, make sure that maybe pay attention to the track record of the sources. Look for different opinions. Don't always take sources from the right or from the left, mix it up, kind of triangulate the information that you're hearing. I think that it's really important, again, back to this listening, to listen to the language. I get some days fascinated, if I'm not angry, listening to the news, to hear the extent to which a lot of the media plays on our emotions. So they're not sharing facts with us, they're tugging at us from the heart. Numeracy, people should work on their numeracy. You think about things like somebody says, well, something increased 100%, and our immediate reaction is, oh my gosh, that's a huge increase. But 100% increase of 1 is 2. So if we're talking about number of some kind of crime in the whole US that went from 1 to 2, that's a 100% increase, but it really might not be a significant increase. So you have to think about the numbers and how numbers are being used. Yeah, but that's so much work.
It is. And so you explained, someone who listens to that might then say, oh, maybe I should look into what sources I'm using. But in a situation, let's say in this scenario, it's in the workplace, or it really could be anywhere. If a heated situation arises out of a disagreement, and let's say somebody is using an unreliable source, and that's the fact or the not true fact is rooted in disinformation or misinformation, what is the best way to de-escalate it? Because chances are, like you said, it's playing into their emotions, it gets people fired up. What is the best way to help bring that down, whether it's a bystander to that situation or maybe you're in that situation directly?
Well, first of all, one of the things that people say, whoever people are, is there's only one person you can change, and that's yourself. So in a situation like that, you can't necessarily control whatever that other person is doing or thinking, but you can control how you're reacting. And I have observed that the most unsuccessful productive disagreements are really those times where emotion totally takes over and people stop listening and stop thinking. So I think as walking into the situation or finding yourself in this situation, that would be the first thing, is de-escalate it by not matching that emotion and coming back at it. The second thing I would say is, again, this concept of the goal is not to win in a productive disagreement. And that even could be in a political conversation around a dinner table. There's, what's the benefit? You're right, makes you feel good, probably makes the other person feel bad. So that's not really, you don't come at it from that perspective. But then I think that there's ways that you can learn how to ask questions. In my opinion, in a situation like that, rather than tell, it's better to ask. So first of all, you can go into that curiosity mode and really try to be learning. So who is that? Oh, what source is that? I've never heard of that source before. Whatever your thing is, but ask questions. How did you come to this point of view? Or, oh, what are some of the facts that support that? Or I don't know very much about this situation. Tell me more about it. Whatever. But something to draw that person out, to get them to really start talking about and exploring for themselves the situation, and then asking questions that might shape the direction of that thinking. Like, well, what if that wasn't the case? Or what do you think would happen if such and such happened? Or, getting people to think more about their opinion instead of this just, I'm hanging on to it because it helps me feel like I'm part of the tribe that feels this way. It's hard. I think it depends, though, on your audience. How well do you know this person? If it's somebody you don't know well, you might not want to engage as much as somebody that you know better, or not. I don't know. I've got a couple of relatives that I would probably just let them go and wouldn't even bother to try to poke at it. Just let them go. Other people, I could have an engagement that would be interesting. So you got to know who you're talking to.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. You have to like read kind of the situation and can you have a productive conversation? And kind of building off of that, in working in both the public and private sectors, how does the role and or necessity of productive disagreement change in the workplace throughout your career as you've experienced it?
I don't think it matters so much where you are. I don't think public sector, private sector. I think that what changes is more the culture of the organization you're in and how receptive it is. I was very lucky, again, to have worked at GE, and it was funny to me because I did meet Jack Welch after I left. He came to Penn he was promoting a book, and you could go on the stage and get a copy of the book and get him to sign it, which I did. And immediately I engaged in a disagreement with him. I'm telling him, I think you're missing a really important point when you talk about your success. And, oh, really? What do you think? And then we got into this conversation. I thought, oh my God, here we go again. But he just fostered that. He invited that kind of a dialogue. I've been in other situations where the management felt challenged by that, and I would have to come at it more gently or in teeny tiny baby steps. So really, it's the culture.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for all of your thoughts. I certainly learned a lot through this. And it definitely flows nicely from our first episode. I think people can watch that and then gain a lot of information, tips from this episode with you. So to close out, do you have any closing thoughts or final messages to our audience?
My final thought is, as we've already discussed, productive disagreement is hard to do. it takes a lot of work to be able to do it well. It can make you feel uncomfortable. I would even go so far as to say it can be scary in certain situations. The result can be isolating, but I think that it's so worth the effort to engage for either the better solutions for your business or for your community that we've briefly touched on, for your own personal growth, that you become a broader, more effective critical thinker. And I also think that it will lessen some of the stress that we all are feeling in this world. That rather than this negative energy coming from all of these directions, learning how to take a negative energy and transform it into something positive, I think can really lessen stress. So I encourage people to do it, even though it's hard.
Thank you so much.